to this next panel. So our panel, in our panel, we're going to discuss research agendas on migration for the next decade. Migration and refugee law and policy is perhaps among the most urgent and politically difficult issues within and between states. In today's world, one of the most central international legal frameworks we have to secure protection for at least refugees, the Refugee Convention, is arguably becoming increasingly irrelevant. At the same time, new international frameworks are being developed, most notably the UN Global Compact on Refugee and Migration. However, these new legal frameworks are non-binding on states. The concept of international protection is actually not mentioned in the Refugee Convention at all, but in the mandate of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, which does not place obligation on states, but on the UNHCR. At the same time, international protection does occur in the mentioned non-binding UN Global Compacts. A question to ask in this context is how international protection work in these legal, non-binding, binding circumstances. I actually wrote my master thesis on international protection back in 2017, but that's a very strict doctrinal legal analysis. So I'm very excited to hear Hakan Sicakkan's presentation, which I think will address some of these issues from sort of a broader perspective. So Hakan, he's a professor at the Department of Comparative Politics at the University of Bergen and is the principal investigator of the UN-funded project Protect, which, as I understand it, has worked on the conceptualizing of the right to international protection and understanding the development of new international frameworks within the field of migration. And as you can all see, Hakan is with us digitally. We are all very excited to hear your introduction on the findings you have made in the project and your perspectives on where research should go from here. So Hakan, the word is yours. Sound is not working.
Okay.
Yes, now you're on. Good.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot to Siri and Bergen Exchange's group for inviting me to this exciting panel. I really look forward to your both responses and your own views about the future research agenda on migration. Siri asked me to speak a little bit about the findings in the Protect project. It was funded not by the UN, but the European Union. It was a Horizon 2020 project. We had, it is now concluded. I'm using the past, that's why I'm using the past tense here. It was concluded in July 2023. And we had important findings there. There were 12 universities and 50 researchers who actively researched. And the project was not very much about international protection, but it was about basically refugee protection, which is something different, which is narrower than international protection. But we still had some findings that are relevant for international protection, and we tried to expand the refugee definition and looked at how, for example, the Global Compact on Migration could be used, the international protection scheme in connection with the 1951 connection. It was the legal part of the work, but we did also institutional work there. 2 of the 12 universities were non-European, 10 European, 1 Canadian, and 1 South African university. And the countries that we focused on were on 3 continents, Africa, Americas, and Europe, and this included Turkey as well, in different parts of the project. Now, I will make it a bit easier by showing my slides to you. Okay, what we did was to identify the sets of protection tools. This means, in summary, policies preferred by different actors in the international protection system. And these were norms about international protection, what international protection and refugee protection should be. And the governance modes, this was about the institutional compositions around refugee protection and asylum processes, and the discourses that were used by the relevant policy actors. This is from UN, EU, the governments and civil society organizations and citizens as well. All these were later related to each other. And the project assessed how the different tools, the identified tools, have worked in refugee protection before in different contexts, and identified the best performing norms, governance modes, and discourses. Of course, the validity of the results are dependent on the countries included. But again, many countries were included. And we tested the performance and resilience of these tools with respect to, for example, whether citizens would tolerate the best working tools, protection tools, whether these tools would be resilient and applicable in crisis, in economic, political, mass migration, and COVID crisis. And we also looked at how they performed in different situations. And cleavage pressure test, this means then the conflicts, the international conflicts and national conflicts, whether the tools that we would propose would stimulate some conflicts or would be part of existing conflicts in the international and national arenas. So we choose then the tools that were most reliable and usable, applicable with little conflicts in different contexts. So as you now understand already at this point, the findings are very elaborate, very detailed, and I don't have enough time to present all of them. I will just give you a general view of it. I told you already that we mapped policies of international protection and then identified the best performing policies. There were several criteria, of course, to define what best means. I will not be able to go into these either. And then feasibility tested the policies, as I said in the previous slide. These are the research components or work packages that we had. Comparative legal studies that made efforts to link policy with the existing human rights standards. We see that on paper, policy is aligned a lot with human rights standards that we have, but in practice, they don't. And especially the current Migration and Asylum Pact of the European Union is quite far away from compliance with the Human Rights and Refugee Convention, international law in general. And then we looked at the international determination procedures, which sorts of procedures produced the best way of guaranteeing the rights of asylum seekers. Again, a comparative study of 17 countries with data of institutional structures from 2000 to 2020. So 20 years of asylum procedures in 17 countries were coded in like 1,500 variables and then analyzed in relation to their effectivity. And then the external policy of the European Union, Canada, in international protection. This is a very well-known field. The external policy of the European Union is notorious for avoiding protection responsibility for refugees. And then civil society involvement in international protection. We identified the ways of civil society involvement and the problems associated with them. And then compared to historical study of asylum institutions' independence from the state, we found here, for example, that more independence from the state institutions, better conditions for asylum seekers and war refugees. And then handling of entries and arrivals at border zones. This was an ethnographic study of 6 critical entry points in Europe, Canada, and South Africa. There are important findings here as well concerning how vulnerability is handled by different actors at the border zones. And as I said, the tests were applied to the best functioning structures. So the general result, I'm giving you only the general result. International protection is lost in migration policy or migration. What the countries are doing is that, as you know, international protection or refugee protection is governed by international law. What states are trying to do, or doing actually in practice, is to draw international protection into the national policy domain by using institutional and policy tricks and normative tricks. So they are trying to move international protection from the domain of international law to the domain of national law so that they can have more power. And we identify the subtle ways that they use to do this. They are not directly visible. You cannot directly blame states for violating international law, but they are just institutional structures that are devised in such a way that they produce some outcomes. Or, for example, putting in some migration clauses that look very innocent into the asylum laws so that asylum law is aligned with the country's migration law. Asylum, international protection, is not to be treated like the migration phenomena because it is different. It's about the protection from life danger, torture, and etc., whereas migration is mobility that does not necessarily involve such threats. So we looked at migrants, protection seeking migrants, asylum seekers, and refugees. Refugees are people who are recognized by the by a state or by the UNHCR as people who can. Yeah, according to the definition in the 1951 convention, asylum seekers are those who have formally lodged an asylum application, and protection-seeking migrants are people who are intending to lodge an application but have not been able to do that yet. So they have either not been able to leave their country, or they are on the way. They are, for example, they may be, for example, on a boat in the Mediterranean. And then the migrant category. So the 1951 Geneva Convention actually forbids its member states, the UN member states, to use entry rules, border entry rules that apply to regular foreigners on asylum seekers. That means that asylum seekers are not to be blamed for not having identity documents, visum, and etc. And it's when states ask for these documents, it's a violation of the international law. But these clauses have all been included in national asylum laws now, and there's not much to do about it. So conflation of the categories of migrant and refugee and immigration and international protection, this is what we found throughout. Migrant and refugee categories are conflated in laws, in policies, in institutional designs. That is, the same institution is treating refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants which is again giving a leeway to states to treat refugees as usual migrants. And asylum procedure designs merge border entry and admissibility procedures, which again allow states to use national entry laws to asylum seekers and refugees. And the civil society organization and public opinion. In the public opinion, we also find a lot of conflation of the categories of migrant and refugee. For example, we found that in the social media networks around the UN, the distinction between a migrant and refugee was very clear. Whereas in social media networks and other internet pages and etc. around the EU, there was total conflation of the migrant and refugee categories, except one period, and that was when the Ukrainian crisis started. Then the media and internet and the EU itself separated the migrant and refugee categories very willingly. So this gives us the suspicion that such conflation is made intentionally. Okay. So one of the what to do about this situation? It is important to distinguish between international protection and migration, border security and development in laws and discourses and in institutions, separate institutions for international protection. It is a must. And separate laws for migration and asylum. So one of our recommendations to the European Union was to separate migration and asylum laws, which they have merged now in Migration and Asylum Pact through a whole of society and whole of holistic approach. And we also advised to adopt the new global compact on migration norms regarding migrants' human rights to provide protection to the protection-seeking migrants. It is because this protection-seeking migrants is the soft stomach of the international protection that we have, system that we have today. And the only document that is trying to do something about this is the Global Compact on Migration. So we advised the EU to adopt and truthfully implement both compacts. Okay, so what should be done after this? Now, of course, my vision for the future migration research does not only derive from this research. I have other types of research as well, like public sphere, citizenship, integration, minorities, and etc. And also, there are new developments in the society. We know, for example, through previous research that the global inequality is increasing, and there is an emerging global wealth oligarchy, and there is an development towards changes in the mode of production that we have through the development of robotics technology and artificial intelligence, and we have climate change. All these are global issues that are globalizing politics. So there is a political globalization that is in progress, and this political globalization is making nation states, political landscapes, the political conflicts and alliances, etc., in nation states similar to each other. This means a standardization of the political systems and political landscapes. This includes party systems, ideologies, and etc. We also show that this is the case through surveys of citizens and surveys, big data surveys of internet and media and etc. So we can show that there is an increasing similarity. And this is then causing the emergence of transnational political actors and transnational and global cleavages. And Within this new framework, the meaning of migration or the role of migration within the whole global system and national systems is changing. For example, when you take the artificial intelligence technology now, it is about creating one single truth. You ask artificial intelligence the same question 10 times, and you get the same answer with different formulations. Alternative answers are mentioned only shortly. If this happens in politics, our democracies are based on the variety and diversity of truths. Our democracy is based on competition between truths. If there is one truth, this means that the democratic system will be affected by what's happening. But this is in the far future. And robotization, again, if it goes very far, in combination with the global equality, global wealth oligarchy, and mode of production, we are going to have changes, radical changes in the class structures overall in the world. These radical changes will be towards a two-class society where you have the managers of technology, managers and owners of the technology, and a citizen mass that doesn't have to work but gets basic citizen salary. We know that some countries are experimenting this, and some of them have already rejected, luckily. Now, the outcome of this will be weaker states, stronger anti-establishment actors, new political parties and groups that are global, actually, one fit for all political cleavages, that is the same political conflicts in all countries. And when classes disappear, when we get only two classes, politics will be about sharing the surplus that will be created by robotics and technology, etc. So identity politics, who will make use of or be entitled to the entitlements from the surplus. And then agonistic plural public spheres instead of the Habermasian version that we have today. Now, the meaning of migration here will change. We already see a development in all states' migration laws that promote expats and managers. Now, almost all West European countries allow highly skilled managers and leaders to move as they wish. They are almost free, without any consideration of ethnicity, nationality, race, and etc. This was not the case before. Before, nationality was an important criterion when work permits were given. On the other hand, as citizens will be benefiting from a surplus that they haven't been producing themselves, migration of other people than managers will be less desirable in the forthcoming 20-25 years. A few days ago, we organized the 22nd Nordic Migration Conference here. There were like more than 200 papers that were proposed. None of them were about technology, artificial intelligence, robotization, and the new structures. We are still continuing to do the same kind of research that we are doing, but the future is different. What's going on now is very important to include in our research visions. what happens in this development is that nations and countries as distinct natural units of analysis will make less sense. Various transnational alliances at different levels, including regional, state, and local levels, they will become more meaningful when we do research designs. Most of the comparative methodological tools that have been developed within the nation-state context will be transferable to the new units of analysis with some changes. Statistical inference tests and comparative research designs will be redundant, where big data can be analyzed with artificial intelligence is available. Migration will attain a radically new meaning and function, which means migration between the economic center and the economic periphery. But then the migration of managers and leaders, others will not be allowed to move. So we need to consider our concepts and theories' applicability to the forthcoming situation already now. So technology, artificial intelligence, robotization should be big parts of our research, including the newly developing political globalization, because these three things are strengthening and catalyzing the political globalization that is creating similar countries all over the world. Thank you very much. This is the short version of what I had to say.
Thank you very much, Hakan. Our next speaker is Ruth Rubio-Marin. You're a professor of law at the University of Sevilla and the European University Institute. And your scholarship includes several contributions within the field of migration. Now we'll mention a few. Your Cambridge monograph on migration as a democratic challenge, of course, but also 10 years ago in 2014, you edited and contributed to chapters in the book Human Rights and Immigration. And you're currently co-editing the Edward Elgar handbook.
Less clear in terms of normative terms about the clear divide when it comes to migration, if we think of involuntary migration, which I take to be most of the migration. But anyway, I think that in terms of rendering humans invisible, dehumanizing, commodifying, and extracting, I would imagine that the migrant is probably the paradigm. You know, an extractive labor force now threatened to be taken over by robots, but of course they do not vote. So it's really easy to see how this could happen. So in this volume, I mean, part of what was nice these days is that several of the themes that came out already in various sessions came also in the research as relevant themes. We discussed in one session health issues and welfare and how migrants face barriers. And I'm centering on human rights challenges. So barriers to healthcare, including legal, linguistic, and financial obstacles. I think more attention needs to be placed on mental health issues with stress and trauma associated with migration, often linked to detention experiences, arbitrary detentions. Many migrants are detained without due process, and sometimes for very extended periods in very overcrowded and inhumane conditions without adequate access to healthcare, food, or sanitation, and often experiences all kinds of abuse, including sexual abuse by the smugglers, by their peer migrants, and by the authorities that they interact with. Family separation and children's rights was another topic that came also in the child rights session. Of course, the grotesque family separation policies, but also unaccompanied minors. In my own country, in Spain, there's been an awful conversation that totally dehumanizes I mean, there's like, we are overcoming any kind of moral restraint. So now, and it's this rendering a human being a migrant, and then anything goes, right? So now that includes minors. Of course, care chains, which are not a novel phenomenon, but are ongoing in terms of extraction of care resources. It's another form of extraction that ends up extracting care resources, but also separating families, right? When the migrant, often woman, left family behind to then provide care to wealthier nations. Interesting research about how limited the notion of families and how little the actual ties of interdependency are taken into account in family reunification policies. So the role of grandmothers, was the focus of one of the papers in the volume. Of course, border policies and pushbacks and returns, militarization of borders and securitization of the debate. We know what that is doing, violence and injury and death. My own country, again, a scenario of that with much profit that I think Guillermo is going to talk something about, criminal bands and smugglers benefiting from this. And many countries engaging in pushbacks and forcibly returning migrants without considering their asylum claims. I think involuntary returns are also, very much coming to the fore. This is sometimes linked to the growing use of temporary legal statuses. So this has become a real, a quick fix to offer protection and benefits for migrants that flee crisis and disasters and political unrest. But, the EU, Latin America, but of course, it means often that these individuals will remain in a legal limbo and can stay in that legal limbo for years. So in terms of, challenges, what does it mean to return people after they've been often, many, many years? Think of the migrants who fled Afghanistan or Myanmar of South Sudan for more than a decade, or Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, now raising the prospect of deporting Syrian refugees. We heard about access to asylum and legal protection challenges. I agree, there's an erosion of asylum rights, and many states are restricting access to asylum. I think it's interesting to remind ourselves that according to recent data, 80% of the world's refugee population is being hosted by countries that together represent only 19% of the world's income. So, this is to be borne in mind. And then something that was also mentioned, the territorial externalization techniques that are becoming so trendy. Italy now proposing to have asylum detention centers in Albania. I think it's still under legal challenge. Of course, the EU is an expert on buying gate security with money. Tunisia and Morocco being some of the countries that bilateral agreements are struck with Germany and Spain engaging also in bilateral agreements. United Kingdom came with its own idea about relocating asylum seekers to Rwanda. So this territorial externalization techniques as a way of not really living up to legal obligations. At the same time, I think we see the Refugee Convention increasingly stretched out. More and more is being tried to be packed under the whatever, because, we have the soft law, we have the compacts, but the little hard law that we have, we try to creatively make use of. We're too scared to reopen the conversation of amending it because we're not sure that amendment would be more encompassing rather than the opposite. But of course, this creates, misfits, right? And I think the whole climate-induced migration, I think Kande is going to talk a little bit about that, is a good example. Climate-induced migration, think of Somalia and, the historic drought, more than 1 million people, but also climate disasters that happen en route. I'm thinking of Spain and what that means, the Mediterranean, but also the crossing of US-Mexico border. Undocumented migrants, and I think, there it's a process of normalizing dehumanization, basically. You were talking, the first speaker was talking about how international law is being emptied out by, national law. And I would say that there's a parallel process, and which is even national law. What we see is migration law emptying out all other forms of national law. So labor laws, constitutional law. So as soon as you can name something as, this falls under the migration law, it becomes a state of exceptionalism that kind of exempts you from living up to any other legal obligation. So it's not a question about more legal instruments in that sense. I mean, it would be ideal if you could have the right ones, but we also have the Convention of the Rights of all Migrant Workers and Members of their Families, which targeted both illegal and undocumented and documented migration. It's a question of how these legal instruments are being hollowed out. And of course, the problem is also that this is becoming, as we know, politicized. So lots of connections with the autocratic conversations that we've been having, because of course, irregular migration is prompting the backlash, the autocratic backlash in many, many countries, Netherlands, France, Italy, Slovakia, Greece, Finland, Turkey, the US. So rising xenophobia and discrimination linked to the far-right anti-immigrant discourse, which in itself then has connections to the anti-gender equality discourse, demographic anxieties, nativist anxieties, and all of this fueled by political rhetoric and, yes, AI and misinformation. Something that came out in the volume was the need for more intersectional analysis of all the branches of existing migration areas, and including refugee law, domestic workers, socioeconomic rights, family migration policies, and violence against women. There's an urge to expand the analysis of these areas of law through intersectional lenses that take into account sex, gender, gender identity, age, race, and religion. And finally, yes, migration and AI. So the EU is becoming, the expert on smart borders, surveillance technology, automated decision-making to make the perfect panoptic society. So yes, robotization, what does that do to a labor surplus, but also image recognition, so biometric recognition now that can engage into emotions analysis and micro-expression analysis so that you can detect deceptive behavior on the borders. So who do you think are lying? Speech recognition, I'm just mentioning some examples because I think these are purposefully not very publicized examples, speech recognition, so that you can detect the country of origin of the person, maybe applying for asylum, so that you can biometric recognition, so that you try to prevent double claims, and all of this, of course, done in an automated way, so cost efficient, but with very, very difficult, not to say impossible, legal recourse. I will stop here and let my colleagues go deeper into some of these. Thank you.
Wow, fantastic. Thank you so much. So I'm very excited to introduce our next speaker, Mansoul Asal. He's a professor of social anthropology at the University of Khartoum and currently a scholar at risk here at the CMI. He also holds the position of Professor 2 at the Department of Social Anthropology at the University of Bergen. And Mansoul, you have written extensively on migration, refugees, internally displacement, and also peace building. And I'm very excited to hear your thoughts on what should be on the agenda on research on migration for the next decade.
Thank you, Martha. Thank you for my friend Hakan. We have been together 24 years ago as part of EMER group studying migrants and refugees. And I did my PhD on refugees, and I studied Somalis and Sudanese who are living in Norway. Much of what I wanted to say was mentioned by my colleague here, but also Hakan has mentioned some of the issues that represent challenges for us who are researchers on this topic, but also for policies. And there are a few points that I would like to make. Some of them have already been made. One relates to the securitization and externalization of borders, something that the EU has been doing for some time now. And in Sudan, we had the so-called Khartoum process, which was funded by the EU. And the idea was to provide support for the law enforcement agency in Sudan to just not allow people to cross to the Mediterranean. This is happening at a time when there are some reports that show that is more than 80% of refugees are actually in the global south. I came from Uganda earlier this week. And Uganda is one of the countries that adopt a very open policy towards refugees. And as a matter of fact, as we speak, Uganda is the country that hosts the biggest number of refugees in the continent. It provides for refugees livelihood opportunities. It provides them with 5 years residence permit as when you're established as a refugee and all of that. Yet in policy and even in academia, the whole discourse is on this side. It really doesn't cater for what's happening down there in the south. And this is quite strange because although it is established as a fact that what's happening down there is by far more important and critical than what's happening here, yet everything is here. And even in the process of knowledge production is happening at this side and reproducing the same kind of discourse that ironically is leading to externalization of borders, securitization of migration, and all of that. So there is a need to invert traditional knowledge and policy hierarchies when it comes to migration and refugee studies. This is something that is really needed. And there is also a need to center the refugee experience, both in terms of researchers and research participants. And this is one way of decolonizing the field of refugee studies, because it happens that somebody is always talking on behalf of refugees, but not refugees themselves. And this is something that needs to be dealt with. And then knowledge also should be responsive to the context in the global south. This is from the angle of knowledge production. But I think even from the angle of policies also, you cannot pretend to curb migration or the flow of refugees by externalizing our borders and by pretending not to see what's happening there. Because if the problems that are pushing people are not addressed, we will continue receiving refugees all the time. And I think this is something that people need to address. Now, if you look at what's happening in Sudan since April last year, we're talking about 13 million people who were either internally displaced or refugees in the neighboring countries and further afield. You cannot think of stopping the flow of refugees from Sudan if you don't sincerely address the causes that is making them leave the country, which is the war. Unfortunately, the EU is completely disinterested in what's happening in Sudan. You can hardly see Sudan in the news channels of any European country. See, so these are some of the things that we as researchers need to alert policymakers and policy and practitioners attention to this direction instead of simply making migration as a security threat. I think I'll stop here.
Thank you very much. We also have two excellent emerging scholars in our panel, two PhD candidates who are also part of the PhD course. So I will first give the word to Guillermo Perez, who is a PhD candidate in political science at the University of Texas. So,
thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's great to be here. My reflections are primarily based on the case of Latin America, in the Latin American context, especially in the Venezuelan context, in the Venezuelan migration crisis. That is one of the most challenging crises and refugee crisis in the history of our region, and one of the most overlooked. And I want to start with a quote, and I put attention to this because when I heard this, I was really shocked. And the quote is this: "These guys will begin kidnapping people. They will kill politicians. They are making a mess in the country. The only thing I hope is that God can help us." Surprisingly, this is part of a conversation between two Chilean narco dealers that I obtained from a telephone interception in a judicial file I got during my research last year. And the Chilean narco is talking with another Chilean narco about some foreign gangs that arrived to the country in recent years because of the Venezuelan refugee crisis. These gangs have caused significant problems across different countries in Latin America, affecting not only the business of local cartels or local gangs, but mainly affecting migrants. Groups like, for example, the so-called Tren de Aragua mostly target their fellow Venezuelans. They attack their own fellow Venezuelans. They do not focus too much in extorting or killing people from the country that is that belongs to the host country, for example, Chileans, Colombians, Peruvians, or Argentinians. The violence is primarily internal, occurring among migrants from the same country. So these gangs in foreign countries attack other groups of migrants that are from the same country. So it's like non-state actors attacking other groups of migrants. So it's a really complex situation and a really, I don't know, strange. And these gangs have two main line of business. The first one is human trafficking. To give you some context, in Latin America, we lack a strong coordination between governments in migration. So we have poorly managed borders that in some ways become stateless spaces. So, for example, the space that is between Bolivia and Chile is like a stateless space. So what is happening right now is that these gangs are building border controls in these spaces. So we always say in criminal governance literature that these kind of groups replace the state in some way, that they accomplish some governance functions. But this is totally new because they are creating border controls. So this is like border controls before to the border controls of the state. So it's that totally new, and I think it can generate a lot of problems. So they decide who enter and who doesn't. And they also charge migrants fees to assist them in crossing the state borders, generating all this lucrative business of smugglers and things like that. And the second line of business of this kind of groups is extortion. Once these groups gain a foothold in the country, they take over certain territories and start imposing extortion schemes that are highly organized and sophisticated, they typically start by targeting group of migrants. So they enter to the country, they go to a place where, for example, a Venezuelan gang enter to the country, they go to a Venezuelan neighborhood, and they start extorting Venezuelan people. And then they start extorting Chileans, and they make their business bigger. What is striking is the structured nature of these extortion processes, because this is like a kind of due process in some way. It has distinct stages, clear penalties. It's almost a bureaucratic system that starts with a WhatsApp message. You have to pay me, I don't know, $100 for your business. If you don't pay, they're going to raise the amount of money. And if you don't pay, they're going to, I don't know, cut you a finger. Then they're going to cut you a hand. Then they're going to kill your brother. Then they're going to kill you. So it's like a process that is really established, and it's like, it's impressive how it's almost a bureaucratic system. And so this dynamics also tie into broader trends involving the migration of criminal groups in general. Because, for example, in Latin America, we are seeing right now that some Mexican groups and Brazilian gangs are increasingly going transnational, making it essential for us to examine how these criminal organizations move across borders and interact. For instance, there are some clues, at least this is one of the things that the Chilean prosecutors were investigating, clues of some relationships between the Brazilian PCC, with, for example, the Cartel de Sinaloa working in Chile, or the Cartel de Juárez working in Chile. So they are building this transnational criminal governance landscape that is generating a lot of problems in unexpected contexts, like Chile, Uruguay, Costa Rica, that were countries where we didn't see things like that, things like this before. So I think it's crucial to develop a more robust research agenda in Latin America that explore the relationship between criminal organizations and migration, focusing mainly in three areas. First, the migration of gangs that create these extortion-based economies, primarily targeting migrants. Secondly, the establishment of another research agenda can be the establishment of criminal control border and quasi-states in the borders and within the territory. And thirdly, I think the transnational alliances and conflicts between major cartels that operate across multiple countries. And as a final thought, and circling back to the telephone interception that I mentioned earlier, I think it's important to consider how these dynamics affect the host countries and the migrants, how they influence, for example, the public perceptions on immigration, how they reshape the criminal landscape, how they impact the lives of thousands of migrants and refugees. How do we protect, for example, refugees and immigrants from these non-state actors? Because we always say that we need to protect immigrants from a state, but now we should protect immigrants from non-state actors like criminal organizations that are also immigrants. So how do we do that? And I think this is a really important question that has significant variations across and within countries that need careful study and analysis. And that's all I have for now. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Guillermo. Our final speaker is Candela Perez. She's a PhD candidate at the Department of Political Science at the University of Washington. So, final word is yours.
Yes, thank you so much again for having me here. I'm very excited to hear everyone's thoughts. I guess I had a quick comment that I think is going to give some thought on this question of the politics of categories in migration studies, and sort of what professor has said about rendering, so this trend that we have seen in the EU of rendering sort of any human being a migrant, and then anything goes. And how it has been discussed how some states might be avoiding in the EU their legal obligations and how they're doing it. So I will also give 3 general points throughout that I think will be important for the next years in sort of this large field that is migration. But again, my thoughts here also kind of engage with the summary for this session. So I'm bringing it back a little bit and to the 1951 Refugee Convention specifically. So first, I wanted to acknowledge that the framework might indeed becoming a little irrelevant in the sense that it is maybe unable to encompass people's experiences in the 21st century. So talking about the convention here specifically, but in another very real sense, I think it can be argued that it is still very relevant, just not in the way that we would think. This is in the role it plays in creating the refugee-migrant binary. So the migrant-refugee binary is a concept which different scholars such as Dr. Rebecca Hamlin and Dr. Lamis Abdelati have put forth in recent years. It refers to the idea that paying attention to the politics of bounding immigration categories reveals the ways in which the state, but also other actors such as the media, have increasingly dichotomized the categories of refugees and migrants in the global north based on a legal fiction, tending then to favor the rights of refugees over the rights of migrants based on the idea of following obligations established by international law. The binary intends to rest on the different determinants or causes upon which people decide to move across international borders, that is, with refugees fleeing political violence or persecution, and migrants moving to sometimes find a better life is framed many times, or for economic reasons. So then it imagines refugees as completely involuntary and migrants as voluntary completely as well. However, we know we have some scholarship in migration that finds that people often move for complex and sometimes very interconnected reasons. So for example, Crowley and Skleparis in 2018 were told in one of their interviews with a Syrian asylum seeker in Greece that they had fled not because of political persecution directly, but because they were unable to get safely to their business in the context of the war, and therefore their family had no food to eat. Some people on the move also live in different places and then leave those places for different reasons. And so perhaps a more appropriate way to think about forced migration might be as a spectrum rather than as a dichotomy. But the refugee-migrant binary nonetheless is shockingly persistent in many forums across the EU and the US, and it has very real consequences for the kind of moral and legal obligations receiving states and societies feel towards the people on the move, and ultimately their experiences. And therefore also gender processes of racialization have also resulted in these framings of crisis that we, I think, if we have lived in Europe around the 2015, we have heard this a lot, the refugee crisis around migration in the global north, which have then provided the context under which the state can make use of these legal categories as a tool for denial of rights and further discrimination and exclusion of people on the move, such as we saw in family separation policies under the Trump administration, which I think, again, connects to this idea that once someone gets labeled a migrant, then anything goes. Also, the binary completely obscures questions of justice around migration, mainly the connections between the reasons why people move across and within borders, and colonialism, imperialism, and climate change. I think this has also been touched upon a little bit. So the question then might become looking forward to a new framework, not only how do we protect people on the move that need it, but also what do we owe them? I think this is very important to think about in the context of climate change as well, which is the second topic I sort of wanted to highlight, as it is getting increasing attention in migration studies, and which not only affects states and people differently, but also for which states and people are differently responsible. And so to wrap up and make my last point, I think we also need to think more about migrants as economic and political actors. We know, for example, again, in the context of climate change, that remittances sent by immigrants serve in certain contexts as ex-ante disaster preparedness and ex-post reconstruction funds. And as I mentioned too in my other talk, the intersection between social movements and immigration is largely unexplored in the social movement literature. But for example, immigrant activists in Berlin have mobilized to disrupt this refugee-migrant binary by reappropriating the category in claiming that, quote unquote, we're all refugees. So thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. So this is actually what we have time for. We have. It was a lot. It was amazing. So we'll take a break now, and hopefully we can discuss these issues over coffee. So yeah, thank you for listening. Thank you.